I'll wait just to say. So with this series, What Should I Believe? We really are looking at lots of different things into history. It's called apologetics, which is the study of reason behind your faith, basically. And so last time I presented on why we should believe in the Bible. And there'll be some, I would say this is kind of the part 2 of that section, really because this is, talking more about what I should believe in Jesus. However, before we get to that, there was a few questions that came up. So one that was asked was, when was Jesus actually born? Now, most historians actually believe that Jesus was born between 6 BC and 4 BC. Many even narrow it down to about 5 or 4 BC. Now, why is that? This is really because someone messed up. And that's kind of simple. But the calendar was actually, our modern day calendar was created centuries later. So this was about 525 AD. And this AD is also, it's the year of our Lord, basically, in Latin. For those of you who know Latin, which is many of us, probably the most of us that know Latin, right? Some people do. Well, that's great. You know more than I do. But there was this monk who basically wanted to come up with this calendar system, and he was trying to actually use Christ as the middle point. So before Christ was BC, the original BC, and now they've been trying to change it to this BCE mentality, but he actually did a pretty good job. This was 500 AD, there wasn't a lot of modern technology, there wasn't any modern technology, so he's trying to sift through documents and things back then, and really kind of the sticking point was he was, if you compare it to 500 years later, he was off by like 5 years, which is like a 1%. And in most places, if you're 1% error, that's not too bad. Where this is kind of documented is actually around King Herod's death. So King Herod the Great, his death happened in 4 BC. It's actually a pretty well studied date in history. Partly because of Josephus, so he was a Jewish historian. We're going to talk more about him a little bit later. But in his writings, he describes that there was a lunar eclipse shortly before Herod, and this was in Judea. So there's only certain places in the world, just like our solar eclipses, that you can see things like that. So you could map that there was a solar eclipse, and then he also died right before Passover. So it actually narrows the date pretty considerably for that. So that's where this kind of 4 BC is when Herod died, and based on the Gospels, we can tell that Herod was alive when Jesus was born, and so we know it was probably at least 1 or 2 years before that, and especially before that decree where Herod said, kill all the babies in Bethlehem. The other thing is that Jesus' age also can be determined later in Luke. So there's Tiberius' reign. And so Tiberius Caesar, Jesus begins his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. And this actually corresponds well to AD 27 and 29. And Luke specifically says he was about 30. He didn't give us that exact age. But again, kind of back calculating, so doing some addition. So 15 years. Tiberius Caesar is also a well-documented fact from multiple different historians. And he started his reign around, so he actually started as a co-regent. So he started kind of like a understudy to the Caesar at the time, around 13 or 12 to 13 BC. AD, and then he became the actual emperor in 14 AD. So that's why there's kind of also this gap of AD 27 to 29, because he actually started to reign earlier than the death of the Caesar. And then he became Caesar usually probably around 14 AD. So again, kind of backtracking, 30 years minus 27, it goes to that 5 to 4 BC, because there's no year 0, so remember that. You go from 1 BC to 1 AD. The other interesting thing, we know about this star of Bethlehem, right? And is there any historical evidence of this? Interesting, this is something I didn't know until recently, but Chinese and Korean astronomical records, they also record what's called a guest star, meaning that it was there and then it was gone. They said that it probably lasted somewhere in the time frame of about 70 days, but this was from some of the writings, and these people from the East were very good at studying the stars. There's also some other star kind of constellations and things that happened at that time that were also significant, like Jupiter and Saturn came close together. And then there's even like the King constellation had these bright stars in there. So there's a lot of kind of astronomical events that were happening at the same time that are suggested to say, was that part of this star in Bethlehem? In addition to, this guest star, which maybe it was the angels, and they could see that as well. So just kind of interesting thing, but this was actually in 5 BC, also well documented. So with that, I think just showing you that kind of diagram that we looked at last time, that, looking at when Jesus's kind of ministry started in 27 AD, and that 70 weeks prophecy going back to 457, and then Jesus's death in 31 AD is, again, kind of consistent with that history and timeline. And then the other question along that was, is Christmas really Christmas? The answer is probably no. We don't have a great way to kind of really pin it down. If you look into it, though, the shepherds were camping out on the hillside in the wintertime. They usually slept in tabernacles or caves, even kept their sheep kind of covered up to keep them warm. So it probably wasn't in winter in December 25. December 25 was actually a competing religious holiday. It was like the Day of the Sun in Roman times, and so that date was kind of trying to pull people on a way to kind of say, like, you either need to decide to worship your sun god, or you need to decide to worship Christ. So it wasn't necessarily like a pagan holiday, but it was kind of designed that way to kind of conflict with a pagan holiday, if you kind of look at it that way. So it was probably sometime in the spring or fall, most likely, because usually harvest season was in the summertime, and so they think it's probably the spring or the fall. And the other kind of question that came up a little bit last time was around the Messianic prophecies, and like, what are the chances of these happening? I know last time we mentioned that there was about 300 different prophecies about Jesus, and some of them are kind of what I call soft prophecies, where they don't really say like the Messiah will come like this. It's more like tied to some other king or tied to some person in the Old Testament. However, there was a scholar, Peter Stoner, who looked at, if you had 8 prophecies, what are the chances that Jesus would fit those at all? And basically it's one out of this really large number. So it's actually 100 quadrillion, if you want to get technical. And what are the chances of that? So if you took the state of Texas and you put silver dollars all over the state of Texas, and you picked one of them, so again, this is an analogy, so I'm going to take one of them, I'm going to mark on it, I'm going to put it somewhere in the state of Texas, and it's not just one layer of coins, it's 2 feet worth of coins, okay? And then I'm going to say, somebody in the audience, I'm going to say, Carter, I want you to go find the same coin that I hid somewhere in Texas. Like, that's the chance that the Messiah would meet 8 prophecies. Now remember I said there was up to 300. And then they went on to kind of do a little bit more research, and they said, okay, how about 48 prophecies? There's probably 48 really like solid prophecies. So that's the probability of one with 157 zeros behind it, and that number doesn't even have a name. So like the other one had quadrillion, this one doesn't. It just keeps going. And again, kind of similar to what we talked about with that fine-tuning argument. So this is about equal if I said, okay, I'm going to want you to pick one atom in the universe, actually 2 universes. We have the second universe over here, and I'm going to pick one atom, and then now I'm going to say, Vienna, pick an atom in one of those 2 universes that I picked. Like, that's the chance that Jesus met 48 of the prophecies. And if you included all of the soft prophecies, there'd be 300 of them. So just think about what that number would be like. So basically the mathematical probability is 0 that would happen. So again, amazing kind of information to kind of look at. So with that, I did want to highlight just a few things. So we are getting almost halfway through our series. Today we're going to be talking, like, is there evidence for Jesus? And this evidence for Jesus is, where can we look at things And really, I think for me, and just a lot of people, we look at the Bible as Christians, but what's outside of the Bible? So what are these kind of non-Christian, Roman, Jewish sources out there? Are they independent? Some of them actually don't like Christ, and they actually were going to write about him. So one here is Josephus. I mentioned him earlier. And he wrote several different books. He was a Jewish historian. He was actually a Jewish priest and a military commander. And he's also quoted as one of the most famous non-Christian sources of first century Judaism. So, but in his writings, and this was actually a late first century, so this is just a few years within the lifetime of Jesus and the people that first saw him. And he affirms that Jesus existed. He was a known teacher. He performed deeds that were perceived to be extraordinary. He attracted the Jewish and Gentile followers. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers continued after his death. So there was Christians that followed him. And so importantly, that Josephus did not present Jesus as a myth. He wasn't saying that, there was this potential person. He's actually saying that this is what was happening at that time. There's also another writer, so he's also a great Roman historian. He was a senator, an orator, he was a consul, so he held positions. And then, because remember, a lot of people back then didn't know how to read and write. And so usually the people that were educated were the ones that were documenting history and keeping track of things. And so he actually mentions a person called Christus, or Christ, who suffered under Pontius Pilate, under Tiberius' reign, which was, again, similar to what we just talked about with Luke. And then he was he's independent confirmation that he found this person in Judea under Pilate. So another outside writer. And then there's this Pliny the Younger, which there is a Pliny the Older. So I don't know if it was a different way to say that there's a first and a second, but he's the younger of the two. And so he also reports that the Christians worshipped Christ as a god. This showed that there was an existence of this organized movement of Christ in itself. So he also was a Roman senator, a lawyer, a governor. So again, kind of this person of nobility. So this is important as we look into history, and I think it's important to kind of look at how many different references there are. So there's really, just like I mentioned, a few of them. These are strong, direct references that quote Jesus or something about him. There's several indirect references that could be talking about Christians and the faith that they have, and then there's a few other ones as well. So really, conservative minimum that there's 7 different authors that talk about Jesus. And probably more, like 9 to 12. So how does that compare with other major figures? So one, Jesus, is in this lifetime, like 4 BC to 30 AD. The earliest surviving source after his death was probably from Paul, which was within about 20 to 30 years. And then Josephus and Tacitus actually wrote them within that, again, a lifetime, so 60 to 80 years after Jesus. And then the number of independent sources was about 9 to 12. These are non-Christian sources, so that's not including the Gospels, which are also well documented as biographies of Jesus. Compare that to Socrates, who he had some early sources, but he only has about 3 to 4 outside sources, verifying even his existence. And then I think this one's fascinating to me, that Alexander the Great, who is this well-known, historical figure, he actually didn't have his earliest source after his death. So his biographies were written 300 to 400 years after his death. And so this is a long time, and nobody's questioning, is Alexander the Great a real person? And these historians were very late in actually writing about him. And again, there's actually less documented independent sources of Alexander the Great than there is of Jesus. And same with Julius Caesar, where there's probably comparable sources, like 5 to 10. And then he had some personal writings that he kept up as well. But again, it's not to the level of Jesus. So Jesus is one of the most documented historical figures that we have in the ancient world. So there's also no competing argument. So none of these ancient sources are saying that Jesus was fictional. They all believe that he was a real person. Josephus clearly states that this person, Jesus, had these things happen in his life. Kind of follows along right with the Gospels. There's also this Christianity didn't just begin without a founder. Nobody was saying that there was these legends that kind of sprang up and then all of a sudden people started believing in this Christ. Because thinking about historical figures that aren't real. So like Father Christmas, if we're thinking about like Santa Claus, like their legend kind of grows over time, it gets bigger and bigger. But then people are like, where did the idea of Christmas come from? Or where did not Christmas, but from Santa Claus, where did Santa Claus come from? You kind of have to think, and you're like, well, I'm not sure where that came from. But it's also obviously grown and become this bigger thing. The dispute around the historical figures, even just like I mentioned, Josephus and Tacitus, it was not about who Jesus was and that he existed, but like it was more around was he really God or who he claimed to be. So I think that's one of the quotes says Jesus is one of the best attested non-elite individuals of antiquity. And what I mean by non-elite, we think about like Alexander the Great and Caesar, like these were all rulers of the known world. So you think that somebody's going to write them down, like kings and queens get recorded. If I said, okay, name somebody that's in the United Kingdom other than the queen and king, you're going to have a harder time, or who's not in the royal family. And this is somebody who's not in the royal family. He's this little known man who came from basically nothing. But because of his teachings and his life, he changed the world. So what about the Gospels? The Gospels are biographies. There's also letters. So Paul also writes several things within the lifetime as he talks to many people that were also eyewitnesses. So many modern scholars treat them as early ancient biographies that can combine theology and also the traditions of history. Last time we looked at several things that Luke had written about different places, and we're going to talk some more about that as well. So we also had this nice example last time of how you can talk about the same experience and have very different perspectives. And that's really what the Gospels are about. And here's some examples. So Mark says that Jesus was buried in Joseph's tomb, but Matthew says that he was just in a new tomb. Luke said it was never used, and so these are kind of three different ways of saying the same thing. John also said that it was in a garden, and then Mark says that he was buried in fine linen. Matthew said the fine linen were clean, so they're never used before. John then also adds that there was aromatic spices. So actually, when you combine the historical resources, you actually get a more full picture of the event. You can say, oh, there was clean linen in this nice garden, and it was beautiful, and it was never used before. And so it's a nice way to kind of combine the stories together. And a good example of this too is if you ever meet somebody that's married or dating, you usually ask, tell me about your story. Like, how did you meet? How did you get together? How did you propose? Things like that. And it's always interesting, like my wife and I, sometimes I tell the story and I have a version. Sometimes my wife tells the story and she has a version. Sometimes there's facts I don't remember, and sometimes there's facts that, no, she remembers everything. So with that, though, it really kind of gives this idea of what's called internal coherence without forced harmonization. So with these kind of four witnesses of the gospel, there's this kind of legal principle that comes up. So what if they were the exact same gospel? Like they said, there are four different authors, but they wrote the same thing. This is actually, in the legal world, collusion. So if I said, hey, we're all going to get together and we're going to say all of this stuff happened at the exact time in the same way, we're going to repeat the same story, we're all going to say the same thing over and over and over until we all get it. Okay, now we're going to go tell the people. That's actually going to do you harm. So don't get in trouble with the law. Don't collude with anybody. However, there are, some perceived things that are different. Just like the examples I gave, there are some small differences. Even I'll highlight one. The angels at the tomb. One of the Gospels says that there was an angel at the tomb, and the other one said that there was two angels at the tomb. Which one's right? The answer is probably yes. I'm going to give you another example. If I said I went to Spokane, Washington over the Christmas holiday, how many people went? Just based on my story. Me. I went. However, my whole family went, like my kids and my wife came with me. So was I lying by me saying I went to Spokane? No, it's the same thing. So it could be the same thing, like maybe only one of the angels was talking to somebody and you can record it that way and you can say that person had a conversation with an angel at the tomb. That doesn't mean that there's no other angels at the tomb. It just means that that conversation happened with one other person. So it's again kind of looking at the context of the things that, but none of the core identity or unity of the Gospels is wrong. So there's this non-negotiables, like, did Jesus die? Yes, all of them agree. Did Jesus raise from the dead? Yes, all of them agree. And the wonderful teachings of Jesus are consistent all throughout the Gospel. So none of these non-negotiables are different. It's all these kind of little nitty-gritty details that any one of us could write differently as we describe the story. So I think with that, we kind of jump a little bit into, okay, the story can be slightly different, but still the same. But archaeology and the Gospels, I think, has really exploded over the last 100 years. Now, archaeology can't prove like the theology of the Bible, but it can definitely help, because if you had authors that were telling you incorrect areas and places and people and times, then you're not going to trust the context of that document. So we mentioned part of this as well, but the Pontius Pilate inscription. So this was found in 1961, and it's a Latin inscription in the 1st century AD. It says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And so it just shows that he was a real person. He has this inscription behind it. And then there's also proof that there's crucifixion. So it's a rare 1st century burial. This is also important because a lot of people that were crucified were just kind of thrown to the side, like their bodies were disposed of. However, there was evidence from this burial and also others that looked and showed that people after they were crucified, were allowed to be buried. So it wasn't that they had to be just discarded and left to the wayside. And so this was an actual iron nail that went through the calcaneus bone, your heel bone in your foot, and not super pleasant, but it showed that this was also along the timeline of the Roman crucifixion. The other thing that has also been found was Caiaphas's ossuary. So ossuaries are these really kind of ornate. They can be ornate, they don't have to be. This isn't his, but it's his son. So the inscription says Joseph, son of Caiaphas. This was discovered just in 1990. And this is a possible connection to the Caiaphas of the Gospels. And why do we think it's just that? Like, what if I said, oh, it's Matthew's, and then there's like 17 different Matthews that you know? Well, Caiaphas isn't a super common name. And also the timeline of these ossuaries being used was fairly narrow. So they're actually used only between 20 BC and about 70 AD, so when Jerusalem was destroyed. So there's only about a 100-year window that these things were used, which is right in the time frame of Jesus. So just again, kind of another person that could have been tied to someone in the Gospels. And then this one's really interesting, and if you're not familiar, I wrote up a few different verses. So in Galatians 1:19, it says, I saw in none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. And then Matthew 13:55, isn't this one of the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? So Jesus had these siblings, and interestingly enough, just a few years ago, there was this discovery, and there was an inscription on this ossuary that says James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So pretty fascinating that this is, could this be actually the remains of Jesus' real brother, or at least the ossuary that he had? So it's again that there's kind of archaeological evidences, and we can't prove, this was Jesus' brother, but, because there is, Yeshua was the name of Jesus, and Jesus, other people had the name of Jesus at that time. It wasn't just one person, it was like Joshua. And so, again, we can't prove exactly that this is what it is, but again, there was a narrow time frame between 20 BC and 70 AD that these things were being used. So, just again, kind of interesting as archaeology continues to find more and more things, it just continues to verify the historical reliability of the Gospels. Archaeology also verified several first century Palestinian life and culture. So they found synagogues, they found these ossuaries, even coins that were verified, inscriptions and locations. So what are these locations? So I just wanted to point out a few. They've actually found the pool of Bethesda that's mentioned in John 5, the pool of Siloam, which is also mentioned in John 9. These cities have been verified, so Nazareth, Capernaum, Bethany, Jericho, Caesarea Philippi, the Temple Mount on the southern steps, the Garden of Gethsemane, Jacob's Well, Magdala Synagogue, so Mary Magdalene, from that place. So all of these places, as we continue to dig deeper into the history and archaeology, continue to verify more and more, and we also learn more about each one of these places that are more descriptive and probably what we weren't thinking in our mind, especially Bethlehem is kind of an interesting one if you dig deep into that. So what are the minimal facts that we know from history and archaeology? So one is that Jesus existed. He was a real person. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Then the followers were very sincere enough that they believed that he raised from the dead, and then started to spread Christianity. So with that, I kind of wanted to shift a little bit to more focus on Jesus' death and resurrection. So why is this important? Because I think the thing here is that Jesus' death and resurrection is tied to Christianity. If it didn't happen, it doesn't matter. And however, there's even skeptical scholars say that Jesus' death by crucifixion is as certain as any historical event can be. And there's actually, interestingly enough, an American journal, it's a Journal of American Medical Association, did a study several years ago that looked at would Jesus have died on the cross? Now, I like this. If you've ever seen, there's a good movie if you want to watch The Case for Christ, or just look up The Case for Christ book, or it's a good book to read. Kind of talks through a lot of these different things. But one of the things here is the Romans were not bad at their job. Like, if you're paid to kill somebody, you're going to kill them. Especially because in the Roman world, if you let your prisoners get away, you were killed. So if your options are to A, make money by killing somebody, or B, don't kill them and die yourself, you're probably going to kill somebody. So they were pretty good at it. But this American journal looked at kind of the whole history of crucifixion and then the story of Jesus, and verified that, yes, his death was genuine. One, because he was scourged ahead of time, he was extremely weak. Crucifixion impairs your breathing. He can't sustain that. And then at the very end, where the spear is jabbed into his side, it's actually the mixture of water and blood is consistent with what's called a pericardial effusion, or a pleural effusion, which is basically fluid around the lung and the heart. And so when you stab that, it's basically that there's so much pressure around the heart and thing that it's not working. And even if you just stab that, you're going to die probably from that. So just again, they were verifying that the person was dead. You're not just going to not flinch. So partly with this, as we get more into the resurrection, I think it is important to look at this. 1 Corinthians 15 says, "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you that say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is our faith. And more than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God. For we have testified about God that He raised Christ from the dead, but He did not raise Him. In fact, the dead are not raised." So really just saying this is like, if Christ wasn't raised, we're not going to be raised. If Christ wasn't raised, everything that we're doing is a lie. It doesn't matter. So I think looking at what is the evidence for the resurrection. So one is obviously the gospel accounts. They report this empty tomb. And interesting that it's also consistent with this event is that it was witnessed. The Roman soldiers were there. And even in the historical Gospels, it says that, they went to the Pharisees and they said, "Hey, he's been raised up, what should we do?" And rather than the Pharisees saying, no, go back and check the tomb, they said, "Tell everybody that the body was stolen." So it's kind of a verification that the body was not there. Think about it. It's kind of the same thing. Like if my kids came to school and told the teacher my dogs ate the homework, you don't have the homework. It's not that you did it. It's that you don't have it at all. You can't present it. So you're kind of admitting that you don't have this body, in the tomb. So even Jesus' enemies are stating that his body's not there. The other thing is that women are the primary witnesses of this event. They're the first people to show up at the tomb. They're the first people to tell the disciples. Now, back in that time, males were considered the authoritative witnesses. However, when you're telling the truth, you have to tell the truth. Because what if you said, oh, well, me, John, and Peter came there first, and we saw all this happen, and then later said, no, Mary was there. Mary was there first. So it's, again, one of those evidences it's supportive, saying that these people that were writing the Gospels are, again, telling you the truth about the events that occurred. Even if it's against historical and sociological norms, they're saying this is what's happening. Then there's also these post-mortem appearances. So after Jesus raised from the dead, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that there's multiple appearances to Peter, the 12 disciples, James, more than 500 different people. And there's multiple different references to this. And it's a very early creed. And this is actually really pivotal, is because a lot of legends can come about. So I mentioned, like Santa Claus. There's lots of legends about Santa Claus. Even if I asked you, like, where did Santa Claus come from, you could tell me all sorts of weird things about pagan holidays and, different people and maybe Saint Nick and how all these stories kind of got meshed together. But because they're legends, we don't really know of where this history came from. And it's actually been studied that it takes more than 2 generations of people to actually start formulating legends. So there's things around different historical figures that say, well, this historical figure was able to, fight 1,000 people with one sword or a pin in his pocket, something outrageous. It's like, because they're just trying to blow up the story. They're making it bigger and bigger. But it at least takes 2 generations. But this kind of post-mortem appearances, even Josephus, who we wrote about, was only, 60 years after Jesus' death, or even less than that. And it's showing that Jesus' idea of him being resurrected was already established within the eyewitness accounts. So it's not like a legend. It wasn't something that they were following because of that. And so that's an important part of historical, because people say that legend of Jesus raising from the dead happened much after Jesus' lifetime. It's like, no, it happened within the lifetime of his believers and the eyewitnesses of the event. The other thing that's incredible is just the speed of the movement. It was a radical transformation. It's not going to prove anything, but I think it's, again, the support of it, because it's unlikely that these were just made up explanations. I think people see Christianity and say, well, maybe it just kind of spread because it was a neat idea. People liked this idea that the Messiah had come. But if you think about how people were reacting to this, people were willing to die for this belief. And again, we're within this eyewitness account. So people like Peter and James and John, think about John. He suffered multiple tortures, was imprisoned, and Peter was stoned, and had all these terrible things that happened to them. Now, if they were believing a lie and they were just trying to spread a lie, would you die for a lie? I don't think so. I think most people were willing to put away, not just to believe this thing that had happened, but they're also pushing aside a lot of their core beliefs. Even today, a lot of Jewish people are very solid in their beliefs and what they have, and it's a culture. It's a large culture shift for them. But they were able to just spread the message like wildfire, even though they were being persecuted unto death. So I think it's, again, one of those things that, again, supports this sincerity of the people that believe that Jesus had raised from the dead, even within one lifetime. So the next piece, I think, is, did Jesus claim to be God? Because this also comes up several times, is that, Jesus was a good person, and he had some good teachings. He wants us to love other people, but he didn't really claim to be God, and maybe he's just a really good teacher. However, in the Bible, it says there's direct claims. So before Abraham, I am. So that was John 8. And that I am is basically tied to the I am at the burning bush, where it says I am Yahweh, I am God. So he's making that direct claim. then there's this claim of him and the Father being one, also in John. And then there's claims of authority. So he has the authority to forgive sins and to judge the world, which only God can do. And then also in John 20, he accepts worship. And if you're a follower of God, the first commandment is don't worship any other gods. So if you're accepting worship, you would be breaking that commandment unless you were God. So there's multiple different claims that he is claiming to be God throughout the New Testament. So what does that mean? Who was Jesus? So here's a logical test for identity. This comes from C.S. Lewis, because you can say that he was a liar, you can say that he was a lunatic, or you can say that he's Lord. Those are really the three options. And so he gave us no option for just saying that he's a good teacher. Because if he's a good teacher and he's lying some of the time, what did he lie about other times? Like, what's the lie and what's the truth? If he was a lunatic, he's just crazy and he's just off his rocker and he thinks he's God and he's not really. He's, schizophrenic. And then I don't want to follow somebody who's schizophrenic. I don't know about you. I've seen people schizophrenic and they scare me sometimes. So then the only alternative is that he's Lord. Like, this idea that he could just be a good teacher doesn't really fit into the logical argument of the Gospels unless you don't trust the Gospels. And that's where a lot of people unfortunately go to, is that, well, I don't trust the Gospels. I believe that what he said, there was probably some good things. But he was claiming to be God. And it's very clear cut. And why is that important? So why did Jesus need to be God? And I think here it really shows that he himself is self-sacrificial. And the cross is ultimate proof that God is love. Because he took that penalty for me that I didn't deserve. And this really comes back to what's called this theodicy triangle. And this is going to be talked about some next time, so don't miss Tuesday night if you can make it. Because this idea that God's character is under question. Because if God is ultimately all good, and he's all powerful and all just, then he has to make that argument and he has to fulfill that argument. But he could be the only one to save the entire world. He was the lawgiver, so he had to be the one to fulfill the law. He was the life was originally his and it's eternal, and he's the only one that can give us eternal life. So it shows that his love, his self-sacrificial love, is so strong that he's willing to die for us. And a good analogy here that I heard recently was that there was a child who had a terminal aggressive tumor. And to save the child, father, who's a world-class surgeon, had to be the one to perform the surgery. Because of that, it was going to be painful for the son. It was going to be painful for his child. He knew it was going to hurt. But in the end, if he didn't do it, he would die. So he went ahead and performed the surgery. And then the son was saved. However, the father had another son that took his place. And I think this is a powerful story in the sense that Jesus himself was the one who went on the table for us. And the Father himself allowed his own son to die, so that way all of us, his other children, didn't have to. And it also fits kind of in the sense that because the Father is this master surgeon, he knows exactly how much we're going to suffer. He doesn't like that we're suffering in this world, but he sees that every incision that is made is cutting out the tumor. Every incision is getting rid of it. And this Father is also this. He has the power, he has the scalpel, he has the ability to take everything out, and he's the only one that can do it. But he also has the love. He has so much love that he's willing to do anything for us, even be the one to step on the table and take the surgery for us. And because he's going to be our substitute. And this is consistent with what Isaiah says in 2 Corinthians and 1 Peter. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. And by his stripes we were healed. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become righteousness of God in him. Who himself bore our sins in his own body on a tree, that we, having died to his sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes we are healed. Because ultimately what he's trying to do is make that incision, he's trying to make that cut, and give us a new heart. He wants to put in a new spirit in us. He wants to remove that heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh. And I think that's really the essence of, does God exist? Does Jesus exist? Because it is about some of this, studying the evidence around Christ and looking at, is the evidence of the Gospels true? Is there evidence in the writings of other historical figures true? Yes, these are all supporting arguments. But I think one of the biggest arguments is this, that Christ is willing to change our hearts. And if you look at the people that are truly converted, they have a joy that surpasses understanding. It's something that can go beyond just an analytical study of history and archaeology. Because those are all fun for me to do, but if you don't take Jesus as a real person, as God, and somebody who's willing to sacrifice themselves for you, then it doesn't really matter. You have to receive the gospel, not just understand it. So that's my prayer for you today. So with that, let's have a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for today. Thank you for the beautiful snow and for family and friends and a good breakfast and for this message today, Lord. Lord, we just pray that you open our hearts and take out the heart of stone and put the flesh in there. Help us to reach the world for you. Continue to help us as we struggle through this tough life, but we know that it's tough because you're cutting out the cancer, Lord. You're getting rid of sin ultimately, and unfortunately we're stuck in the middle. And Lord, we know there's a great controversy, but you're going to win. So thank you so much for dying on the cross for us. In your holy name, amen. So I do want to highlight just real quick as we are talking about next time. So we have another speaker Tuesday night, Pastor Aaron Clark. He's going to be talking, is there a problem with evil? And I hinted at it a little bit with it's called a theodicy, but really this idea that there are good and evil. Because there's a lot of people now that believe in what's called moral relativism. So what's right for you is not right for me, and it doesn't really matter. And then also this idea, is God really just? So hopefully we can dive a little deeper into that on Tuesday night. And then obviously next Saturday, we'll be talking about, can we trust science? And then the following Tuesday, what happens when you die? Am I good enough? And then the last night, is there only one truth? So some interesting topics coming up. And with that, I will open up if there's any questions or thoughts about today or other days.
Is there any documentation about the disciples, the people that hung around Jesus, that builds
the argument? So the question was, are there any documents around the disciples of Jesus? So there are a few. I would say they're much more gray in their arguments around the disciples, because even there's evidence outside the Bible of how different disciples were to die or died, but they came much later in historical events. So some of the trustworthiness of some of them is not very accurate. But I do believe there is some around. Some of them are major figures like Peter, James, and John, rather than some of the other smaller disciples. Because some of the disciples, if you look through, like if you Googled like how did Bartholomew die, like there's probably some reference to how it was, but it's more not. It's more debatable if it's accurate or not. Yeah. But I can see if there's some word that we can look at next time on Tuesday. Yeah. Yeah.
The guy that created the BD system at MS.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did he not have access to that Luke chapter where he talks about how old he was?
No, he did have access to that. I think what happened was that he got the dates wrong of when Herod was actually alive. So part of it was actually, I think, because of the lunar eclipse and things. So in modern day, we can actually map out when all the different eclipses are. And so he actually just missed the date by a few years. But yeah, he did have the Bible at the time because he was looking at that information, and he was actually he was actually trying to create that BC AD system, so that was like before Christ. He just didn't get it all correct. Yeah. He probably didn't have Josephus to say, "Oh, this is when the eclipse was," or whatever. But I don't know that for sure. 1,500 years ago. Yeah.